My name is Maya. I'm 31 years old. I work as a forensic financial analyst for a mid-sized litigation consulting firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. The kind of job where you are professionally paid to find the things someone tried to hide. I reconstruct paper trails for a living. I find the transaction that happened 3 layers beneath the one that was supposed to distract you. I track asset movement through LLCs, shell accounts, and estate transfers the way some people track packages. My colleagues call me methodical. My friends call me a little intense. My mother always called me cold. I tell you all of this not to impress you, but because it matters to the story. Because the very skills my family treated as personality flaws were precisely the skills that eventually backed my mother into a corner she could not talk, charm, or cry her way out of. But before any of that, there was Grandma Ruth. My grandmother, Ruth Eleanor Calloway, was 79 years old when she passed on a Tuesday morning in February. She had lived alone in her 3-bedroom house in the Ardsley Park neighborhood of Savannah, Georgia for 13 years after my grandfather died, and she had done it with a grace I've spent my entire adult life quietly trying to replicate. She kept African violets on every windowsill. She made sweet tea with exactly 1 lemon, never 2. She called me every Sunday at 10 a.m. Central without fail, and she always opened the conversation the same way. "Baby girl, tell me something that made you smile this week." She was the only person in my family who consistently asked me that. When she passed, she left behind the Savannah property, a house appraised at $148,000. She left behind jewelry that had been in our family for 3 generations, independently valued at approximately $27,000. And she left behind a CD account at Regions Bank holding $19,400. According to a will that had been filed with a Chatham County attorney in 2019, a will I would not discover until 8 months after her death, all of it was left to me. To me. Not to my mother. Not to my aunt. To me, the granddaughter who drove 14 hours from Charlotte to Savannah every Thanksgiving without being asked. The one who sat on the porch and listened to Grandma Ruth talk about growing up in rural Georgia for hours, genuinely, without looking at my phone. The total estate value was approximately $194,000. I was never supposed to find out it was already gone. To understand what my mother did, you have to understand what my mother believed. Renee believed, with a kind of unshakable, unexamined conviction that doesn't need evidence or logic, that I was the difficult daughter. Not difficult in a way she ever clearly defined. Just difficult. Too independent. Too precise. Too focused on things that didn't make for easy conversation at a family dinner. I had never fit the image she had assembled in her head of what a daughter was supposed to look like, and by the time I was in my mid-20s, she had quietly stopped pretending that didn't bother her. My younger sister Brianna was the other kind of daughter. Brianna was 27, easygoing in exactly the way that reads as warm, and she had a gift for making every room she walked into feel lighter. She remembered birthdays without reminders. She cried at commercials. She called my mother 3 times a week just to check in. And somehow, without ever appearing to try, she occupied the center of our family's attention and affection in a way I had never once managed to. I want to be clear. This is not about Brianna. She didn't steal from me. She didn't participate in what happened. But to understand the system that made what happened possible, you need to understand the roles we had each been assigned and how thoroughly my mother believed in them. Here is what that dynamic looked like in practice. In the fall of 2020, I was promoted to senior analyst at my firm. I was 28 years old, and I was the youngest person in my department to reach that title. It had taken me 2 years of 60-hour weeks for major case deliveries and a performance review that my director told me was the strongest she had seen in 7 years. I called my mother to tell her. She said, "That's great, Maya." "Oh, did Brianna tell you she's thinking about redoing her kitchen?" She sent me the most beautiful cabinet samples. And that was it. That was the full conversation about the promotion I had spent 2 years earning. 6 months later, Brianna got engaged. My mother planned the engagement party for 11 weeks. She flew to Nashville, where Brianna lives, twice during the planning process. She created a Pinterest board. She called me 4 times during those 11 weeks, and 3 of those calls were to ask me to Venmo her money toward the catering deposit. I sent $800 without being asked twice. My name was not mentioned in the toast. Then there was the roof situation, summer of 2022. My parents' home in Greensboro needed emergency repair after a storm caused structural damage to the back portion of the house. My father, who has always been the quieter, steadier presence between my 2 parents, called me first because he didn't know what else to do. I researched contractors, got 3 quotes, and wired $11,500 toward the repair costs across 2 payments. I have the bank records. I have the text messages where my father said, "I don't know what we'd do without you." I have the silence from my mother, who, when relatives asked how the repairs had been funded, told them the family had pulled together. The family had pulled together, and then there was the way she introduced me to people. Not with pride, with a kind of careful, almost apologetic framing. Maya works in finance, she's very busy, very serious, as if my competence was a trait that needed softening before it could be presented in public. As if the fact that I had been fully financially independent since 23, had never once asked my parents to co-sign anything, had a 790 credit score and a Roth IRA I'd been contributing to since I was 24, as if all of that was somehow less impressive than being easy to be around. I had spent most of my adult life making peace with being invisible in that family. I had accepted it. I had built a life that didn't require their validation to feel real. What I had not accepted, what I will never accept, is that being the capable one was eventually used as the justification to take $194,000 that my grandmother had spent her entire life accumulating and decided to leave to me. That was the logic Renee operated on. Maya doesn't need it. Maya will be fine. Maya always figures it out. What she never understood is that being capable doesn't mean being without limits. It just means that when you finally reach yours, you know exactly what to do. Grandma Ruth passed on a Tuesday. By Friday, my mother was in Savannah. I couldn't get there until the following Monday. I had 2 active case files that needed emergency handoffs, and I was driving, not flying, because I needed the 14 hours alone in the car to process what had happened. I called my mother 3 times during that drive. She answered twice. She sounded calm, organized. She told me she was handling the paperwork, coordinating with the funeral home, going through the house. She said, and I remember this exact phrasing, "Don't worry about any of the logistics, Maya. Just get here safe. I've got everything under control." I believed her. That is the part that stays with me. Not the betrayal itself, but the moment I chose to trust her with it. I was grieving. I was exhausted. And she was my mother. So I said okay, and I drove, and I let her handle it. The funeral was a Wednesday. 40 people in a small Baptist church on the east side of Savannah that Grandma Ruth had attended for 31 years. Her pastor spoke for 20 minutes and made everyone laugh twice, which felt exactly right. I sat in the front row next to my father and held it together until they played her favorite hymn, "His Eye is on the Sparrow," and then I didn't hold it together anymore. My mother sat 2 seats down from me and cried beautifully. She always knew how to cry beautifully. The weeks after the funeral were a blur of condolence calls, casseroles dropped at the door, and the specific exhaustion that comes from grieving while also trying to function like a normal adult. I went back to Charlotte 10 days after the service. I asked my mother once about the estate process. She said the attorney was handling it, that these things took time, that I should focus on getting back to my routine. I took her at her word. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 8 months later, late October, right in the middle of my wedding planning, I received a letter from Regions Bank addressed to the estate of Ruth Eleanor Calloway. It had been forwarded to my address because I had been listed as a contact on one of Grandma Ruth's accounts years earlier, and the forwarding had never been updated. The letter was a routine account closure notice. The CD account, the $19,400 certificate of deposit, had been closed and liquidated 5 months prior. I stared at that letter for a long time. I called the bank. I explained who I was. They could not give me full details over the phone for privacy reasons, but they confirmed the account had been closed by an authorized party and the funds had been dispersed. I asked when. They gave me the month. It was 6 weeks after Grandma Ruth's funeral. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for probably 4 minutes, without moving. And then I opened my laptop and started pulling everything I could find on the Chatham County Property Records database. The house in Ardsley Park had been sold. Closed escrow 7 months ago. Sale price, $151,000. The deed transfer listed my mother's name as the seller's representative, authorized agent for the estate. I felt something go very quiet inside me. Not rage, not even hurt, exactly. Just a terrible, clarifying stillness. The kind that comes right before you understand something you cannot ununderstand. I called my mother that evening. I kept my voice level. I asked her, simply, how the estate process was going. She paused for exactly 2 seconds. I counted, and then she said, "It's all been wrapped up, Maya." There wasn't much to it in the end. The house needed a lot of work, the jewelry wasn't worth what we thought, and the bank accounts were mostly depleted by the end. These things they cost more than people expect. I said, "I see." She said, "Are you doing okay? How's the wedding planning?" And I said, "I'm fine, Mom. Everything's fine."
I was not fine.
But I was done announcing my hand before I'd played it. I asked her one more question before I got off the phone. I asked it casually, like it was an afterthought. "Mom, did Grandma Ruth ever leave a will?" Another pause. Longer this time.
"No, baby."
"You know, Mama never got around to that." That was a lie. And the moment she said it, something in me shifted, permanently, completely, and without any possibility of going back. 2 weeks after that phone call, I drove back to Savannah. I told my mother I was going to collect a few personal items from the house, not knowing, of course, that the house had already been sold and the new owners were in the process of moving in. When I arrived and found a different family's furniture on the porch, I sat in my car in front of that house for a long time. Then I called the neighbor, Miss Claudette, an 80-year-old woman who had lived next door to Grandma Ruth for 22 years and who had my number because she used to call me when the yard needed attention while I was away. Miss Claudette, bless her heart, had kept a key. Not to the house, the new owners had the house, but to a storage unit that Grandma Ruth had rented on the other side of town. Unit 114 at Safekeep Storage on Abercorn Street. Grandma Ruth had given Miss Claudette the key 2 years before she passed, with specific instructions. "If something happens to me, make sure Maya gets into that unit before anyone else does." Miss Claudette had been waiting for me to come back. Inside Unit 114, in a fireproof document lockbox that I had to cut open with bolt cutters borrowed from the storage facility's front office, I found the following. A last will and testament dated March 4, 2019. Signed by Ruth Eleanor Calloway. Witnessed by 2 individuals. Notarized by a Georgia notary public with a valid commission stamp. The document named me, Maya Denise Calloway, as the sole primary beneficiary of the entire estate. My mother was listed as the executor, but only with the explicit requirement that all assets be transferred to me within 180 days of probate filing. There was also a letter, handwritten, 3 pages. Addressed to me by name. I am not going to read you the full contents of that letter. Some things belong only to the person they were written for. But I will tell you that my grandmother knew, she knew, with a clarity that must have been painful, that her daughter could not be trusted with what she was leaving behind. She wrote it plainly. She wrote it without bitterness, which somehow made it harder to read. She said she loved her daughter. She said she also loved me enough to put it in writing, in front of witnesses, with a notary stamp. I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit and read all 3 pages twice. Then I pulled out my phone and called the Chatham County Probate Court. Here is what they told me. No will had ever been filed. My mother had initiated the estate process as next of kin, representing herself as the appropriate administrator of an intestate estate, meaning an estate with no will. Which meant she had actively concealed the existence of a valid legal document to assume control of assets that were never hers to touch. That is not a family dispute. That is probate fraud. Back in Charlotte, I spent the next 3 evenings pulling everything I could access. I submitted a records request to Regions Bank with a copy of the will establishing my beneficiary status. The withdrawal documentation they eventually provided showed a signature on the disbursement authorization form. I compared it to every document I had ever signed. It did not match mine in 7 distinct ways. The capital M, the loop on the Y, the pressure pattern, the letter spacing. I'm a forensic financial analyst. I know what a forged signature looks like. I now had a notarized will that had been deliberately concealed from probate court. I had evidence of an unauthorized property sale conducted under false pretenses. I had a signature on a bank disbursement form that was not mine. And I had a storage unit key that an 80-year-old neighbor had held onto for 2 years because my grandmother, apparently, had seen this coming. I opened a new folder on my desktop. I labeled it simply, Ruth. And then I started making calls. The first call I made was to an estate litigation attorney named Patricia Okafor, a woman I had been referred to by a colleague whose firm had worked with her on a complex trust dispute 2 years prior. Patricia had 22 years of experience in Georgia probate law. She had a reputation for being methodical, unshakable, and entirely unimpressed by people who assumed charm was a legal defense. We met over video call on a Thursday evening in November. I had an organized folder of 23 documents ready to share on screen before she finished her opening sentence. She looked at everything for 45 minutes. When she looked back up at the camera, she said very calmly, "Maya, what your mother did constitutes probate fraud under Georgia Code Title 53. It also potentially exposes her to criminal liability under Georgia's theft by taking statute. I want you to understand what you're holding here." I told her I understood completely. I told her I wanted to do this correctly, legally, and thoroughly, and that I was not in a hurry. Patricia filed a petition with the Chatham County Probate Court to contest the estate administration and submit the discovered will for formal probate. The filing was a matter of public record. It named my mother as the administrator who had misrepresented the estate's intestate status. It requested a full accounting of all estate assets, the property, the jewelry, the bank accounts, and it formally challenged the legitimacy of every transaction that had occurred since my grandmother's death. Simultaneously, I submitted a formal written complaint to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit. I attached the will, the property records, the bank letter, and the signature comparison I had prepared, a detailed, annotated document showing the 7 points of inconsistency between the signature on the region's bank disbursement form and my verified signature samples. I also contacted the real estate agent who had handled the sale of the Savannah property. His name was Brad Tillman, a 20-year veteran of Savannah real estate who had no idea, when he listed that house, that the woman authorizing the sale did not have clean legal authority to do so. Brad was cooperative immediately. He provided the full transaction file, the authorization documents my mother had submitted, and the closing paperwork, all of which would become part of the court record. The property buyer, a young couple who had purchased the house in good faith, was notified of the dispute through their own attorney. They had not known. They were not at fault. But their transaction was now legally clouded pending resolution of the probate contest, which meant they had every incentive to cooperate fully with the investigation. And they did. Now, here's the part that took every ounce of self-control I have ever developed. I did not tell my mother any of this. I went home for Thanksgiving. I sat at the table. I ate the sweet potato casserole. I asked Brianna about her kitchen renovation. I complimented my father's new reading glasses. I helped clear the dishes. My mother talked about my wedding, which was now 6 weeks away, and I listened and smiled and answered her questions about the venue and the catering and the centerpiece colors. And not once, not for a single second, did I let her see what was coming. I had learned from years of forensic work, from years of reconstructing what happens when people act impulsively and leave evidence, that the most powerful move in any situation is the one your opponent doesn't see until it has already landed. My mother was counting on my grief. She was counting on the complexity of probate law. She was counting on the fact that I had always been the one who swallowed things and moved on because it was easier than the alternative. She had miscalculated on every single point. The court filing was time-stamped November 19th. My wedding was December 14th. I had mailed her invitation, a proper, ivory and burgundy invitation with her name written in calligraphy, on October 3rd, 3 weeks before I found the bank letter, before I drove to Savannah, before I sat on that storage unit floor and read 3 pages of my grandmother's handwriting. I had not uninvited her after I found everything. I want you to think about why. Patricia had advised me that my mother would very likely receive notice of the probate court filing within 2 to 3 weeks of submission, standard processing time, which meant that by early December, she would know that I had found the will. She would know that I had filed. She would know that I knew. And I wanted to see what she would do with that information. What she did was show up to my wedding in white, which told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person I was dealing with. Not someone who would apologize. Not someone who would quietly reach out and try to make it right before the walls closed in. Someone who would look at a legal filing with her name on it and decide the correct response was a white dress and a lifted chin. I had prepared for that too. 3 days before the wedding, I had a private conversation with my mother-in-law, Carol, a retired family law paralegal from Connecticut who had, when I told her the full story, gone very still in the same way I had gone still when I first saw that bank letter. Carol was not a dramatic woman. She was a precise one. She said, "Tell me what you need from me that night." I told her. I also spoke privately with my maid of honor, Danielle, my closest friend for 11 years, who had driven with me to Savannah the day I found the storage unit and who had sat on the concrete floor next to me while I read the letter. Danielle knew every piece of this. She had been with me for all of it. And I told Daniel, my husband, everything. On a Sunday afternoon 6 weeks before the wedding, I sat him down with a cup of coffee and a folder, and I walked him through it the way I would walk a client through a case. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need me to do?" I said, "Just stand next to me." He said, "Always." By the time my mother walked into that venue in white on December 14th, there were exactly 4 people in that room who knew what the evening was going to become. And none of us were going to give it away a single second early. The DJ was playing something soft and instrumental. The candles were lit. The eucalyptus smelled clean and sharp. And I watched my mother work the room, greeting relatives, accepting compliments on her outfit, smiling that wide, confident smile, and I felt something I had not expected to feel in that moment. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even grief, just clarity. The clean, final kind. The kind that comes when you have done everything right and you are simply waiting for the moment to arrive. It was almost time for the family remarks portion of the evening. Almost time. The family remarks portion of a wedding reception is one of those traditions that sounds beautiful in theory and occasionally becomes something else entirely in practice. Ours was scheduled for 8:15 p.m., right after the first dance, right before the cake cutting. The venue coordinator had allocated 15 minutes for it. A few toasts, a few tears, a few laughs, and then back to the music. That was the plan on the printed timeline she had taped to the catering station wall. What actually happened took 11 minutes. I know because Danielle timed it. The first 2 toasts were exactly what they were supposed to be. Daniel's best man spoke for 3 minutes and got 2 genuine laughs. My father stood up with a note card he had clearly written and rewritten several times, and he talked about Grandma Ruth, how she had always said I was going to be something, how she would have loved Daniel, how she was there in spirit, and his voice broke exactly once, which broke half the room with it. My father sat down. I squeezed his hand under the table. And then the venue coordinator handed the microphone to me. I had told her, during our final walkthrough 2 days before the wedding, that I wanted to say something during the family remarks. She had written it into the timeline without question. I had also told her, quietly, privately at the end of that same walkthrough, that I might go slightly over the allocated time, and that I needed her to not cut the microphone under any circumstances until I personally handed it back to her. She had looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Understood." I stood up. I smoothed the front of my dress. I looked out at 300 people, Daniel's family, my family, friends from college, colleagues, neighbors, people who had driven 4 hours to be in that room, and I took one breath. My mother was seated at a table 8 feet to my left, still in white, a glass of champagne in front of her, watching me with an expression I can only describe as carefully composed, the look of a woman who has spent a lifetime managing how she appears in public and was not about to stop now. I started the way I had planned, warmly. I want to start by thanking every single person in this room for being here tonight. I mean that more than the usual wedding speech version of it. This night means more to me than I know how to say. I paused. I also want to talk about my grandmother, Ruth Eleanor Calloway, because she should be here tonight and she's not, and I think she deserves to be spoken about honestly, not just warmly but honestly. The room was quiet in that attentive, respectful way that rooms get quiet when someone is about to say something real. Grandma Ruth worked her entire life. She raised her family in Savannah. She kept a house. She kept African violets on every windowsill. She called me every Sunday at 10 a.m. She left behind an estate worth approximately $194,000, a house, jewelry, and a savings account, and she left all of it to me. She put it in a will. She had it notarized. She left it with a neighbor for safekeeping because she was, apparently, a wiser woman than any of us fully appreciated. I felt the room shift. The specific quality of silence changed. 300 people leaning forward by approximately 1 inch. That estate was liquidated without my knowledge. The will was concealed from probate court. My signature was forged on a bank disbursement form. The house was sold. The jewelry is gone. The savings account was emptied 6 weeks after my grandmother's funeral. Complete silence. I have filed a petition with the Chatham County Probate Court. I have submitted a complaint to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit. I have retained an estate litigation attorney. And I want the people in this room, the people who are family, who are witnesses to our life, to know what happened. Not because I want a scene at my own wedding, but because my grandmother deserved better. And because silence has never once protected me in this family. It has only ever protected the people who hurt me. I looked directly at my mother for the first time since I had started speaking. She was very still. "I forgive you," I said. Quietly.
Clearly.
I want to say that in front of everyone here because I mean it and because I need it to be true. But forgiveness is not the same as silence. And it is not the same as pretending. Grandma Ruth left me something. And I intend to make sure her wishes are honored. Legally, completely, and without compromise. I paused one final time. To everyone else in this room, thank you for being here. Thank you for witnessing this. I am so grateful for every single one of you. I handed the microphone back to the venue coordinator. I sat down next to my husband. Daniel put his hand over mine on the table and did not say anything, which was exactly right. The room stayed quiet for probably 4 full seconds, which in a room of 300 people is a very long time. And then my mother-in-law Carol began to applaud.
Slowly.
Deliberately. And the room followed. My mother did not applaud. My mother picked up her clutch, pushed back her chair, and walked out of the venue. Several relatives watched her go. No one followed her. The DJ, who had clearly been given some version of a heads-up by Danielle, waited exactly 30 seconds and then brought the music back up, something warm and celebratory, and the evening continued. People danced. The cake was cut. Daniel's grandmother told me I was brave and then immediately asked for a second piece of dessert, which felt like the most honest response anyone gave me all night. People ask me sometimes, not often, but sometimes, whether I regret saying what I said at my own wedding. Whether I wish I had chosen a different moment, a different venue, a different way. I have thought about it honestly. And the answer is no. Not because it was the most comfortable choice. It wasn't. Not because it made everything clean and easy and resolved. It didn't. Legal proceedings are slow and exhausting, and they cost money and emotional bandwidth that I would have preferred to spend differently. But here is what I know. For most of my adult life, I protected my mother's image at the expense of my own reality. I swallowed the promotions that went unacknowledged. I wrote the checks that went uncredited. I made myself smaller and quieter and less inconvenient because I had somehow absorbed the idea that keeping the peace was my responsibility, that the family's comfort was worth more than my own truth. My grandmother did not believe that. She wrote it down. She had it notarized. She left it with a neighbor in a fireproof box because she loved me enough to make sure I would eventually have something solid to stand on. The least I could do was stand on it. The morning after the wedding, Daniel and I had breakfast in our hotel room. We ordered too much food and ate it in our robes with the curtains open. At some point, he looked over at me and said, "How do you feel?" And I thought about it, really thought about it. And what I felt was not triumph. It wasn't relief exactly, though that was part of it. What I felt was lighter. Like I'd been carrying something I'd gotten so used to carrying that I'd forgotten it had weighed it all. And I had finally, in front of 300 people, in an ivory dress with 4 clips in my veil, set it down. My grandmother used to say, "Baby girl, the truth doesn't need your protection. It just needs your permission." She was right. She was right about most things. And if you are somewhere in the story, if you are the capable one, the invisible one, the one who keeps showing up and paying in and being taken for granted by the people who are supposed to see you most clearly, I want you to hear this. Being the strong one was never supposed to cost you everything. You are allowed to stop protecting people who are not protecting you. And the moment you decide to stop, really decide, quietly, clearly, without drama or announcement, that is the moment the story starts moving in your direction. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you.
Genuinely.
This kind of story takes something out of you to tell, and I think it takes something to sit with it too. If any piece of this resonated with you, the invisibility, the financial betrayal, the moment of finally deciding that enough is enough, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever been the capable one in a family that took that for granted. Tell me what you would have done differently, or what you wish you had done sooner. If you're going through something like this right now, a contested estate, a family member you're afraid to confront, a situation where you know the truth but haven't figured out how to hold it yet, I want you to know that the most powerful move is almost never the loudest one. Document everything. Talk to a professional. And give yourself permission to stop carrying what was never yours to carry alone. If this story was new to you and you want more, subscribe. There are more stories here. Real ones. Specific ones. The kind that remind you that intelligence, patience, and a well-organized folder of evidence will outlast almost anything. And one last thing. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best, that was never the truth about you. It was only ever the truth about them.